Now, obviously, if the banks don't get it right, they're going to be subject to more competition from different kinds of providers, aren't they? And Brian, I was reading the Global Payments Report, which RBS was involved in producing, and there's a lot in there about alternative payment providers, and a whole section on PayPal. At the same time, you say that, it says in the report that it's a very small amount of total transactions. I think it's sort of 0.6% or something like that. I mean, how much of a threat do you think that these kinds of new players are, and how should the banks be responding to them?
So they're clearly a threat, and I think it's right to say that the volumes are small today. I think they're much larger in some what you would call sub-segments of the transaction banking industry. So if you look at some of the players, I think they're targeting the cards part of the transaction banking industry, not trade and not cash management. Because if you look at a multinational's requirements for cash management with 80 subsidiaries in Europe and all wanting to bank with a single provider on a single contract, that's very much tied to current accounts in the banking industry. Yeah. But if you look at some of the what you would call the niche parts of, well, not so much niche, but more specialized parts, I would say, of the cards-based industry, then you'll find the Googles, the Amazons, the PayPals, anybody that has an interest on selling online where there is a settlement with an instrument, and the instrument is typically a card-based instrument, I think you'll find a huge amount of competition coming from that source. And I think that extends not just into the card space, but I think it will extend into mobile telephony and the whole range of activity that goes associated with making the buying experience online, or even the buying experience in a store for a consumer, a more easy process, an easier process, if you like.
All right. Mark, do you think that the banks are responding in the right way to this competitive threat?
I think it's right to be considered a competitive threat, and I think you're right, Brian, as well, to talk about specifically approaching it from the cards perspective as it stands today. I think what we're seeing right now, and bear in mind we run, if you like, the faster payments service for the country, we're seeing a movement away necessarily from solely cards. So why can't we use the payment infrastructure of the country, which does an immediate payment, irrefutable, at the point of initiation, through an infrastructure that's existed now for over 3 years and has never failed. And so the conversations we're having now is how do we, as a PayPal, for example, or anybody, for example, utilize that kind of infrastructure? How can we get into it?
Karen, are you finding the same sorts of competitive threats in Asia?
Yes, I think, well, going back to PayPal, PayPal's 4 billion in revenues now. That makes them a pretty large company. You've got M-Pesa down in Kenya with several million customers doing payments from mobile phone to mobile phone. Absolutely. It's catching on very quickly. In India, you can make payments up to 5,000 rupees on a mobile phone without a bank involved at all. Yeah. So these things are impacting. Now, a lot of these at the moment are coming from areas of the population which may not have bank accounts at the moment. So that may be the future bankable population that is moving to different channels. But I think we have to take these very seriously and really look at the creativity and adopt those into the banking practices. So we have to take them very seriously.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we tend to think of these things as retail products, but they are becoming, okay, all right, well, tell me.
I think with Brian's comments on the card, I think that's expanding into eating away into the cash transactions. So cash is moving out of circulation. It's more transactions which are electronic. Yeah. And with devices and things like the tablets and stuff like the Square, which replaces acquiring terminal, you can set up a stall anywhere in the middle of the street and have a 100,000 transaction running end of the day. Yeah,
I think I've just hit another particular nail on the head, and that's mobile. We have a lot of institutions we've spoken to have long considered mobile to be kind of the next great thing, almost, in terms of a way for payments. Not necessarily at the corporate level, but certainly individuals. Although given check replacement, I think mobile is an alternative mechanism for all payments, including corporate payments. And mobile, for me, is one of the key things going forward. I think the Payments Council just announced that they're coming out to do some research and look at the market and look at some of the RFPs. We're heavily involved in that. And I think, I guess my hope is that common sense prevails and we don't reinvent the wheel 10 times when we can actually use some existing infrastructure to move it forward.
So I think it's a critical point on cooperation type questions, because I think there's really 4 areas where the banks have a key requirement to cooperate. One we touched upon earlier when we talked about cybercrime, which is about defending the system from criminals. And I think that's an area where banks have an obligation to make sure security and risk defences are good. And you might include in that cooperation with law enforcement agencies and so on and so forth, which is allied to that subject. The second is we've just touched upon, which is about infrastructure. There is a need for common infrastructure so that customers get a better experience. If you have, all sorts of disparate infrastructure, ultimately the clients are not going to be happy dealing with lots of different infrastructure. And that doesn't matter whether it's a retail customer or whether it's a multinational customer. Multitudes of infrastructure and so on is not going to work. And the third area is about standards. If we're going to exchange information between ourselves, and if we're going to have the highest standards so that security is high, then the banking industry, and indeed anybody else who touches the payments world, needs to have agreements about standards about how we encrypt things, how we deliver information, how we're efficient in delivery of information between us, and so on and so forth. And then the final area is about connectivity.
Yeah.
Because each bank has got to connect to the other bank, and it's got to be standard connections.
Yeah.
That's right.
And they've got to be efficient, and they've got to meet the minimum regulatory risk hurdles, and so on and so forth.
All right. Well, we're just getting to sort of near the end of our time now, but what I think would be very useful and interesting just for these last couple of minutes would be, can we think of some examples either in your own banks or in other banks where these kinds of cooperative agreements are working well? In all the areas you mentioned, in delivering the infrastructure and the standards and the connectivity.
I'm not a bank.
No, that's all right.
But I would say a fantastic example of this kind of cooperation is the BACS infrastructure that's been around for 30 odd years. It's not failed. The volume is amazing, trillion a year, and the same thing would apply to the link network for ATM sharing.
Yeah, I think we should go back to the very old principles of correspondent banking. Banks have been working together for centuries. We're now automating all that very effectively, but actually the whole world of trade and payments wouldn't exist unless banks
And
work
And
together.
also, I think the crisis has brought correspondent banking back into vogue, really, hasn't it?
It has, absolutely.
So I would say it's brought transaction banking back into vogue, of
Yeah.
which correspondent banking may be part
A
of it.
slice.
But because it's been recognised, I think, now that this is a solid part of the banking world.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's produced good results through the crisis. It didn't create the crisis. It is of real economic value. It's creating a payments infrastructure that every single customer needs to settle trade obligations and so on, and helps them manage their risk. And it is a relatively low risk from a credit risk and operational risk point of view,
Absolutely.
relative to some of the other activities that banks were engaging in run up to the crisis, for example. But I also think that it was rather, a neglected child in a way within the industry, because you had investment bankers, sort of masters of the universe.
Yeah.
You had commercial bankers that were lending money and creating the flow of capital into the economy. You had retail bankers and you had wealth management bankers. And somehow transaction bankers didn't appear on that horizon, and I think they now appear on the horizon. They now have divisions within banks that are run as profit centres, and they're seen by equity analysts in the outside world as being very solid businesses to invest in and creating value for the equity of the banks that they are within. And so I think there's been the crisis in that sense has been good for putting transaction banking back in its rightful place.
All right, well, I think that's a perfect place to leave it, isn't it? Transaction banking back in vogue. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming and for contributing. I thought it was a fascinating discussion, and we'll hopefully enhance on some of the themes as we go forward with the 2 or 3 subsequent sessions. Thank you very much.